My name is Jim Ryan, and I'm the new instructional designer here at EWU. My job here is to take a look at the programs, courses, and people from a different point of view, to see how all these Lego pieces fit, and to imagine how I can help put them together differently to make something new and amazing. Welcome to the Play to Learn podcast.
Today, I'm meeting with Romeal Watson, Kylie Heintzelman, Kimberly Kamel, and Nicole DeKay. This is my first group podcast where we discuss a subject that is very important to me and should be very important to anyone listening: hazing and harassment in the workplace. So, sit back, relax, and enjoy.
So, I'm Jim Ryan. I got Romeal Watson with me. I have
Kylie Heintzelman.
Kylie
Heintzelman.
and then you are
Nicole DeKay.
and
Kim Kamel.
so this is my first group podcast. So this is exciting for me. It's gonna be like a panel discussion, maybe. But we're all here today because Romeal called me this morning and was like, Jim,
Yeah.
you gotta come over here. I wanna do a podcast with these ladies.
Over the years, we talked about doing podcasts, but we're so lazy, we never actually got around to it. We're always like, this should be a podcast, but we never do it. So you actually got it off the ground. So I'm like, damn, come check this out. So,
Well, I got mine off the man. We gotta go work on yours now.
yeah, looking forward to it. We'll see something. We'll see what we could do.
So why are we all here today?
So, I was pulled aside about, this is probably 2 months ago now, about that, from Trisha Hughes over in Counseling and Wellness Services. And they had some extra grant money that was allocated to them from a state agency to focus on anti-hazing. And so they did a few events throughout the year, and she had money left over, and it was like, well, let's talk with the commissioner to see if they have any projects around anti-hazing, particularly in the workplace. And so Kylie, Casey, and I were tasked with the idea of trying to come up with an event to do something. And so I had Kylie look at it. I was like, well, let's see if we can do a panel discussion, find some people who might know something about the subject matter, and see what we can get going. And so Kylie was very diligent enough and found Nicole to talk with us about it. And so we just kind of looked in people's backgrounds. And then through Jackson Riley from Leadership Spokane, I was asking, do you know anybody that does presentations on anti-hazing? And she's like, yes. And then she's also one of our board members. And so she referred me to Kamel. So, yeah.
Well, I usually like to start these out with origin stories. So, Nicole, would you mind telling me where you grew up, where you went to school, how you got here, all that fun stuff?
Yeah, so I grew up in Portland, Oregon. I went to Gonzaga, just down the street from where we are now. And out of my Gonzaga years, I went straight into the mental health field, and worked in pretty severe populations, so both severely developmentally disabled adults and then children who were in a lockdown facility. So they were kids who were generally too mentally unfit to go to juvenile detention, and so they would get sent to this facility where I worked. And so my earliest years were I burnt out pretty quickly working with both populations, because it was just after the market crash of 2009, and there were not a lot of jobs to be had. And so I was working 2 jobs to make ends meet, and they were those 2 jobs. So 60 hours a week with really severe populations on both ends. And I entered a master's program in industrial organizational psychology, which is a really long name for a field of business psychologists. We tend to be the researchers behind the articles that MBAs write. And so I entered that master's program and went into corporate pretty quickly. I ended up as an intern at Boeing to the C-suite, so the CEO, CTO, CIO of the company, the consultant with PhDs, usually in IO psychology, economics, organizational behavior. I was their intern during a time when the leadership practices at Boeing, they've been written out about a lot now. So the things that you have learned that are in the public sphere, I was learning as an intern about the toxicity of leadership and the kind of sycophantic behavior that the CEO had surrounded himself with, so that safety issues were not able to be raised and concerns were not being heard. So the people practices that resulted in planes falling out of the sky was my introduction into corporate America.
Wow.
Welcome to the show.
Thank you. And so, yeah, that's really my origin story. At that time, I'd been told to get a hard skill, so I went into analytics and database development. I have a whole other career as a database architect and have gone far away from that now, but I ended up launching a large multi-billion-dollar program at Boeing in 2018. It was the largest new business development program in the company. When you're talking about $100 billion company, it was big dollars, big. I wanted something on my resume saying that I'd made impact on the business. And in that job, I had had a great career up to that point where I'd learned a lot, but I hadn't experienced a lot of dysfunction at the company. In that position, since there was so much money and it was such a big program, and my manager took a new position in the middle of our launch, I experienced a lot of the dysfunction that you hear about in the news on a different level. But, we were supposed to have $21 million in funding. We got 200,000. We're still expected to hit the same goals and targets. So this do more with less, do more with less. It was so severe on this program. And I was experiencing a lot of the things I had learned about in terms of harm in the workplace. And for the first time in my life, I couldn't perform. I was being bullied from several different ends, experiencing not just that, but like corporate gaslighting that the leaders didn't even know they were gaslighting me because they thought we'd gotten the funding. And so I became very interested in workplace trauma and the impact that it has on people. And when I started digging into the literature, I had my master's in IO Psych at this point, and we were always taught, like, what does literature say? What does the research say? And there was nothing. This was 2016. So I couldn't find anything on this. And so I started just looking more into it. And there's so little out there, even today, on the everyday like stressors that create trauma responses in people in the workplace. I'm not talking about like the doctors and nurses who are working in the ERs. I'm talking about their work environments from their supervisors that cause that secondary trauma response, like outside of just the job itself. And so I went back and got my PhD, studied that, and have started posting. I post online regularly to educate people, just because I'm still the only person in the United States that I've found advocating for this work from like a behavioral science perspective. There's people in Australia, Canada, and the UK who are doing a lot of this work. But right now, there's very few people in the States that aren't lawyers doing advocacy work in terms of like the workers' rights that come along with bullying and hazing.
And Kim, you're the other half of this powerhouse team here today.
Well, I don't know about a powerhouse team, and my origin story isn't nearly as impressive as Nicole's.
Oh, come on.
So I was born and raised in Newport Beach, California, and my roots are in Spokane. My grandparents on both sides lived here. So after I finished school at UCI and graduated, I decided to go to Gonzaga for law school. And I didn't know what I was going to practice. And I started working for a firm. Well, actually, I worked for 3 different firms, I think, during law school. And I decided I don't want to do criminal law. I did some of that. I didn't like going to the jail. That wasn't fun. And having people reoffend with drug addiction. So that I didn't like that. So I definitely wanted to stay on the civil side. And then my first job, I worked there for about 8 months, and I learned about employment law, and I thought that was really fascinating, and a position came open at Witherspoon Kelly. And so I applied for that employment law position, and then I started working for both employees and employers doing employment law work. And what I learned about bullying and hazing in the workplace was that at the lawyer level, you don't really get down on the ground floor with people to get them to stop the behavior, right? You're coming in after the fact and trying to put the pieces back together. And so what I think is important about this information and for people going out into the workplace, like I think it's important for them to learn how to address bullying and what to do and who to report to and how to kind of get ahead of it, because I think there's ways that you can respond to the behavior that will take you on a completely different path than if you just allow yourself to be a target and try to deal with it on your own or not report it. And then I think employers need to put forth some new policies and practices to make sure that people are protected in the workplace. But my experiences mostly I come in because I get calls from the C-suite people, as Nicole was talking about, from companies now, and they weren't aware. Most of the time, they are not aware of the conduct. And it's the frontline managers or some middle management person who reacted or responded in not necessarily the best way. And so we're trying to re-educate, right, those individuals, and then trying to help the employee move past what's happened and figure out a way that the employee can still be successful at the organization and not feel that they were disrespected, essentially.
So one commonality that I'm seeing between both stories is you have both dealt with very at-risk populations and then moved on into the corporate structure. Are there any similarities you've seen between working with those groups during your time?
I think so. I think that there are, when you deal with people who have been harassed or bullied, or they're vulnerable in some way emotionally, it's easier for people to prey on that. And I don't know if those managers or if coworkers acknowledge that vulnerability, but I think there's probably personality traits that they see and are able to decide, okay, I'm going to groom this people to do X, Y, and Z. And so that's why I think it's so important if you can give people some tools going into the workplace about some ideas about how to respond to situations. Then if they are in a vulnerable population, they won't succumb to potentially like the bullying and the harassment. I mean, that's what I would be hopeful for. I don't know if that always works. I think Nicole probably has more experience and more tools.
There's a big grin on your face. You're just ready to go at this question.
So my research is rooted in adverse childhood experiences, which is a study that was done by Kaiser in the late 1990s, so like 1995, 1996. And adverse childhood experiences, it's adversity in childhood that is the greatest predictor of early death that we have. The more adverse childhood experiences that you have, the worse your health outcomes are. The latest stat I saw is that 37% of the U.S. population has at least 4 or more adverse childhood experiences. So that's 1 in 3. And when you have 4 or more, you are like 1,200 times more likely to inject intravenous drugs. 1,300% more likely to commit suicide. Like, there are terrible statistics associated with this, and it's prevalent and extremely common. And then when we talk about adverse childhood experiences and then the impact it has on people, narcissism is a huge problem in executive offices. Narcissism is also an early childhood injury. People who have the personality disorder generally have massive ACEs scores and severe childhood trauma. And so when I think about the bullying behavior of the kids that I worked with before I entered corporate America, I used to joke around like, this set me up perfectly to work with executives. You have to have a certain level of patience because the narcissistic injury that can occur at these levels is so easy and so quick. And then the repercussions are so extreme if you mess up. And so I just think there's such a huge overlap between the populations that I served when I first left in school and then that I've continued to serve because they all come from childhood adversity. Yeah.
So was one more easier to deal with than the other because it was less traumatizing, I guess, in either of your cases? Or was there some other kind of motivation that drew you to your side of things?
I think at the time I thought it was easier to deal with executives because I was being physically assaulted at a job, right? So, I mean, it's a totally different environment. It's the only job I've ever been at where I had to learn holds and I had to physically restrain children. That was my first job, right? And so you think of it that way, like, yeah, it seemed like it. What I know now about complex trauma, I think it's almost worse to be in corporate America because complex trauma happens when you are in a situation that you can't escape that makes you fear for your life or livelihood. And if that doesn't describe a toxic job or a toxic work environment, I don't know what does. And if you complain about work, you're told it's work. It's not supposed to be fun. That's why they call it work. And when I look at that from like a trauma-informed perspective, that's promoting avoidance. That's promoting you shutting down your emotions, shutting down your feelings because it's work and you're not supposed to complain about it. But avoidance has the worst health outcomes for any response that we have to trauma. And so we're telling this whole group of people, your trauma isn't real. And so I think that when I look at it scientifically, like my trauma was very real when I was getting hit and kicked and attacked. And I could look at that and be like, yes, that is something that is very traumatizing. But then when I'm getting gaslit and people are spreading rumors about me behind my back that I find out about months later, that sort of trauma is just as damaging to your body, your mind, and your spirit, but it's avoided.
More elusive. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I'm like, oh, I don't know. I don't know which is worse.
Kim, what about you?
I don't know. I think the mental trauma can be more damaging and long term. You can't shake it as much as the physical trauma.
Right.
So I think at least the physical trauma, you can see it. The mental trauma, I think you don't realize what effect it has on you until later on. And what's hard is I think most people, they've been subjected to some form of trauma or injury over their life. And so everybody's coming with a different experience. And I mean, Nicole, I don't know, but what percentage of people do you think in the U.S. have like borderline personality disorders?
Borderline is pretty, they're so connected to narcissism, but I think it's only like 3%. Oh, like when we're talking about the personality disorder, same with narcissism. I think it's 3 to 6%. But when you're talking about the high levels of these, like where it's close to, it's probably much higher.
So a lot of times people at the executive level, they're high drivers, right? And so maybe they're not acting the most appropriate because they've got these outlying personality disorders that got them to where they are. So with that, my job isn't to fix the person. My job is to make the work environment compliant with the law, right? And to make sure that people aren't being like traumatized. And we don't really have discrimination based on bullying, but bullying can turn into discrimination based on a protected class or a wrongful termination claim or something like that. So my job is to provide advice on A, how to fix the situation, and B, how to avoid the lawsuit. And sometimes that means separation of employment. But in that context, I think it's very interesting because you're always dealing with new personalities, new vulnerabilities, and you're trying to figure out how can we make this work for everybody. And it's challenging, but it's interesting because you never know. Like every single person that you deal with is so different. You never know what's going to happen or what's going to come out of it.
Yeah, there's a lot of interesting attitudes when it comes to dedication to the workplace. And for example, my dad, he grew up post-World War II. And so he was just like, you work and then you work extra when you can. And if there's an issue, you just keep your head down and keep going and you don't speak up and make yourself noticed.
Pay your dues.
And that makes me think that this trauma is also intergenerational because it gets passed down from the parent to the child, and then it gets to be part of the system.
This criteria around work ethic.
Yeah.
It's a complicit.
Oh my gosh, I will talk about intergenerational trauma that's like it's an ignored. Like this piece that you're talking about is so ignored. Workplace trauma that's passed down not only from like your parents to you, because my grandmother has said to me, well, work's not supposed to be fun. So
He's going to yell at me when this comes out. Why did you say that?
Yes, it is one of those things where it does get passed down. But then there's also this piece of almost mirroring a family system when you get stuck with a manager. They're almost like a parent in terms of how much of your life they control. And so there's their own levels, especially when you have one that's like, well, and when we talk about hazing, I had to go through it, so you better do it too. And that's a whole different form that doesn't even come from your family of origin. That's intergenerational, that keeps on getting passed down.
Kim, you have any thoughts on it?
Well, I agree with that the generations all have different work ethics, and we've seen a lot of problems and complications in the workplace because of the different values, right? So when I was a baby lawyer, we were raised by boomers, and it was pick up your head and get to work and don't think about it and work till you drop, just get it done. And then I'm a Gen Xer. And so I know a lot of my peer group thinks that, well, wow, we got smashed by the boomers. And now the millennials are coming behind us saying, well, I don't want to work that much. I want work-life balance. And we look at everybody and say, what? What's that? How is this isn't fair. But so that's been challenging, right?
You didn't get to have a life until you've earned it or something that nature.
But and you can't say that to anybody because they won't work for you. So, I mean, I know I've been trying to adopt and understand the new generations and what their expectations are, and it's just so different. And so I think the best way to deal with that is don't put your requirements on somebody else. Like how you were raised, how you were developed, what you learned. You can't shove that ideology on somebody else. You have to listen to how they want to live their life and respect those values. And I think that if people took into consideration those challenges and didn't force their perspective on someone else, then the workplace would be easier and you wouldn't have as many problems. But that's not what we're left with.
No, and I mean, there's also like systems changes that don't get recognized when we have these conversations. The economic conditions, even of Gen X, is different than what millennials and Gen Z walked into. Like, we're in an economic position where the minimum wage in the United States, you cannot afford an apartment in any city in the US anymore. And so there's been this massive wage stagnation that it doesn't matter how hard you work, you still can't afford to live. And I think the rejection that we're seeing from a lot of the younger generations in this is like, millennials did the thing. We said we went to work and we worked really, 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 really hard. And then none of us can afford houses. None of us can afford to live. None of us can afford children. And it's not just like we're saying no to working hard. We're saying no to the system that has completely broken down since the boomers were in the workplace at the same age as that.
Well, I would even say the structure of the work environment now, where it's few and far between where you'll find a corporation or a company that actually has a laddering system for you to be able to get promoted up. And so a lot of times we're like, I'm working hard and I haven't gotten a raise in 10 years. Nor have I been pulled aside, looked at my performance, and been, suggested for a promote or a title change or whatnot. So you're seeing a lot of people are like, okay, what am I doing all this for? Well, and also they're being all crazy. I don't get a promotion and the opportunities, yeah.
Well, and then speaking back to that, you're going to be seeing that same structure reflected in the business itself, especially in something like Boeing. The people at the top are going to be in the boomer generation. The people that are middle management are all going to be Gen Xers, and the people at the bottom are all going to be these millennials. And because there's such a stark difference between their attitudes towards work, there's going to be this massive amount of friction and more trauma being imparted each time.
And what's so weird about it is it kind of feels kind of like that's comparison could be like the NFL, right? The ones who actually made the cut, they're still probably going to keep that mentality because that's how they did it, and it just worked out for them. But all the other people who didn't work out for it, they're kind of screaming from the rafters about, hey, we need to change this a little bit. But again, those boomers that are at the top of the Boeing thing, they're like, no, this is how I did it. I worked hard, got an internship, worked fine for me. Just keep doing that and you'll make it. And it was like, have you actually seen the stories of those who actually tried that? And that number is getting higher and higher, the ones who are trying to take that traditional route and it's just not working out.
Yeah. There was a viral meme a few weeks ago that came out, and it was like a Wall Street Journal article that was like, bottom 60% of people in the United States can't afford basic necessities. Yeah. And people are like, that's a really great way to say the majority.
So y'all are here because you're going to be speaking to students and also faculty and staff to educate them on this topic. And for a lot of people, you don't really think that it's important until you actually go through it and you have to witness it firsthand. And the experience is going to be different depending on where these people have worked or will be working. So students coming out might be working for like a sole proprietorship that is just, one boss or a few people working with it. And then you're going to be moving into the larger businesses with an LLC, and then some that have more infrastructure than that. So how is somebody just coming into the workforce or just becoming new to this deal with each of those different stages of company sizes when it comes to workplace harassment and hazing?
Boy.
I'm hitting you, aren't I?
I mean, that is just such a hard question to answer because, like, when you're talking about if you work at a small company and you're experiencing workplace harassment, one, you have a lot more ability to affect change. And two, you have a lot less options. At small companies, like a lot of lawyers won't even take your case if you're discriminated against because it's not going to be a big enough settlement. And there's so much discrimination happening right now that getting an employment attorney to even take your case is pretty hard at the moment. And so like it's like there's so many different ways, like when you're talking about that small one where I was like you can affect change, and then when you're talking about a big company you have a lot more legal options while a lot less ability to affect a system. And so it's a hard question. It's a really hard question to answer because it depends.
No, that's perfectly valid. I'm sure from the lawyer side, yeah.
That's what we always say. It depends. Yeah.
Safest.
And right. And I think that you have to decide when is your time to make change, and is this the job you want to have forever? And is it worth filing a lawsuit? And do you live in a small town or do you live in a big city? Because you can get blackballed if you file a lawsuit against your employer. And what do you want, right? And so I think you have to think about yourself and what's best for your family, number one. And then I think you need to decide, is this where you want to grow old and work for the next 20 years? Or no, is this a stepping stone? And if it's a stepping stone, are you going to need a reference to get to the next job that's more important? And so I think that if you're experiencing, and I guess it would depend like what type of harassment, how severe is it? Because in order to prove harassment legally, you have to prove that it's severe or pervasive. It's one or the other. And so pervasive means it happens over and over and over again. And the threshold in different states is different based on the case law. And so, I don't think anybody should tolerate harassment and be subjected to it and continue to work at a place like that. But I think you also need to stand up for yourself and say, I'm not going to put up with it. But it's much more difficult, I think, to fight harassment when you're at a very small company. Because if you go in guns blazing and say, you're harassing me, you can't treat me this way, and I need you to do X, Y, and Z, I think there's a bigger risk that you're not going to have a job there because it's a smaller community. And so when it's a smaller community, people aren't necessarily as receptive to change as in a large organization where you can get lost and go work for someone else, right? And so I think it's more difficult when you're in a smaller company to try to actually make a change and continue to work there. I think it would be easier a lot of times just to move on.
Yeah. And then when you're talking about larger companies, many of them will have, internal policies as to how to resolve conflicts. But that can either work for the employee being harassed or it can sometimes work against them. And I think probably one of the most important questions becomes, at what point, if a person feels like they're being harassed, should they start looking into getting some kind of outside resources versus going through the internal policies?
I mean, when it comes to big companies, I think your first step should always be internal. Because if you don't do the internal process, and you can speak to this, but usually lawyers won't look at your case. And if it's happening to you, your first step is documenting everything that happened to you. So date, location, who was present at the meeting, what exactly happened. And if you can write down how did it make you feel and what was the impact to you, because those impact statements are important. But like the first step is documenting it when it starts happening to you. And then, I think you have to go through the internal process before. And when that doesn't get resolved, that's when you go through external, because oftentimes companies are there to do risk mitigation and protect themselves. And so when you feel like you were not adequately taken care of through that internal system, that's when you go externally.
I think that makes sense. Yeah. I mean, most of the time you want to report to HR if there is a HR. And a lot of times HR has a number of ways to deal with the situation. Typically, there's an investigation. And if it's a larger entity and the person was engaging in conduct that one person thinks is harassment and one person thinks is not, then it's good to have HR be the mediator between the two individuals and find out how to get to the bottom of this situation. I think a lot of times it's a communication issue, right? One person may perceive something as harassment or bullying, and the other person doesn't know that's how that person is perceiving it because they grew up and their experiences are completely different. So a lot of times you can de-escalate a situation by making an internal complaint, and I think that's the way to handle it. My experience has been that you see a lot of he said, she said, and so you never know who's telling the truth. And so in my world, nothing's black or white, everything's gray, and it's shades of gray.
And then assuming somebody was to have to go to the level of acquiring a lawyer, depending on the size of that company, that could also, I guess, influence the interest of lawyers in taking a case in a specific region, because that company is so big, they have so much influence over local politics or local other businesses. So if a lawyer was to get involved, they might want to avoid that entirely, is what I'm trying to say. Or would they be more eager to go after it?
I think it goes either way.
Mm-hmm.
Some lawyers that are plaintiffs' lawyers for employment cases, meaning that they would represent the employee, they thrive on going after large companies, right? They're thinking that, there's probably insurance. And if there's insurance, then this is a big ticket item. I can make a lot of money. I've recently seen a lot of lawyers from California sending demand letters to my clients. And I'm like, what is that person doing? They're not even from here. They don't know what's going on. So I don't think necessarily that the larger the organization, that would be a deterrent for lawyers. I think it just depends on the lawyer and what they're used to and what their experience level is. Smaller organizations, a lot of times they don't have insurance, which can be very difficult in trying to resolve the case, because if there's no money, there's no way to settle a case unless the person is willing to take less. And so that can be very challenging. And a lot of times in my experience, it's sad for the employer because they didn't know this was happening, or they didn't know this manager was screwing up, or a coworker was engaging in this conduct. And so they feel kind of blindsided because they didn't know. And so they could have stopped it, but the person quit because they felt that this wouldn't get resolved. And then there's no money to settle with. So it can be tough on both ends.
I think we're running up against time, but I will ask one more question because I think it's really important, is that what resources would you tell people to go and research in order to get some kind of support for this issue?
It's so hard in the States. It depends on what state you're in.
Mm-hmm.
It's what makes it really complicated in the U.S. for these types of cases. And there's the EEOC, OFCCP, NLRB. Those are some acronyms of government agencies you can go to depending on what's going on. And at the same time, right now, those organizations are not really taking cases. They've been told by the current administration not to. And so, especially around disparate impact, which is a word for a lot of the stuff that we're talking about in terms of like discrimination cases that have to do with age, gender, any other protected class, race, religion, age. I think I said age already. Oopsies, but
I'll edit it. That's fine.
So there are resources, but I think there are fewer currently because they're put into abeyance, which is a fancy word for they're not taking any action on any of the cases.
Yeah, she's right. I actually have a case right now where my client received a letter from, and I was telling Romeal this, that my client received a letter from Department of Justice on an accommodation claim. And we're trying to get a response from the Department of Justice saying, hey, can you give us more time so that we can respond to this? Hello. And we've been calling, and there's the person I don't think works there anymore. My guess is that they were laid off because of the current administration. So I'm like, I don't know what's going to happen with this matter. So that's challenging, right? And then I would say for employers, the thing to do would be to become aware of these issues, buy insurance for this. It's called employment practices liability insurance. And a lot of times the insurance company will have great resources, like they use third parties to give them handbooks so people know how to make complaints and anti-discrimination and anti-harassment policies. And so employers become aware of what the rules are and what they can't allow happen at the job site. And I think those are great ways to educate yourself to make sure that you have a good working environment, because you want to be an employer of choice, right? You're not going to be an employer of choice if you're getting sued left and right.
Well, I know it was a bit of a short time and it was kind of a last minute deal, but I just want to thank you both for your time today and coming in and talking with me. And
Absolutely.
yeah, I think this was just really fun.
I think so too. Very important topic.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you.